Today we look at the first of the women in the Bible from whom we will be learning in the coming weeks, and I've chosen to look at Esther and the book named after her. Matthew Henry says of this book, "But though the name of God be not in it, the finger of God is directing many minute events for the bringing about of his people's deliverance." The story recorded in Esther has many twists and turns, many subtleties, and many timing details. There are many lessons we can learn, both as individuals and churches. Imagine you're going to see a play, a musical, an opera, a ballet, which is unfamiliar. Well, you'd buy a program to get an idea of what's going to happen and let you follow the plot. So let me give you the program notes and suggest that after this talk, you read through the book and look for God's fingerprints. I will start with the setting in time and place. Then we will look at the cast in order of appearance, and then a synopsis of the plot. At the end, we will look at some lessons we can learn. So first of all, the setting. The story is set in Susa, the fortified capital of the vast Persian Empire, which stretched from India to Ethiopia. The year is 483 BC. And the Jews had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar about 100 years previously. Babylon fell to the Persians 47 years later, and the Jews were taken from Judah and scattered around the empire. Then the cast. Well, there's King Xerxes, and in some translations he's called Ahasuerus, but that actually means ruler in the same ways that Pharaoh means ruler. He came to the throne 3 years prior to the start of our story. He was a man of ungoverned temper who was easily manipulated by his advisors. He was a proud, misogynistic despot. Then we have Queen Vashti, a principled woman of strong character. Then we have Mordecai. Mordecai was a Benjaminite whose great-grandfather was among the Jews captured by Nebuchadnezzar. He lived in Susa, which was the location of the royal palace, where often he sat at the king's gate. He may have been a minor official in the king's service, and the gate was where the king would come to meet his people and where pronouncements were made. Mordecai was a devout Jew. And then we come to the heroine Esther. Esther was her Persian name, which means star. She was probably born in Persia, a double orphan. She was brought up in Susa by her cousin Mordecai. She was exceptionally beautiful and charming. Her character was that she was modest, not greedy, obedient, and godly. And then we come to the plot. Act 1, the King's Palace. Scene 1. The king calls a conference of his military leaders from across the empire, probably to plan the proposed invasion of Greece. This lasted 6 months, and at the end there was a sumptuous 7-day banquet. The king displays his vast wealth to impress his guests. The wine flows like water, and the king gets intoxicated. At the end, the king wants to show off his beautiful wife, so he sends for her. Scene 2. Queen Vashti is holding a banquet for the women. When the king's attendants summon her, she refuses to go into the king's banquet to be displayed to his drunken guests. And this was probably because what the king required was in some way immodest. And then scene 3. When the king is told of the queen's refusal, he is furious and consults his advisors as to what he should do. The queen is deposed, and a law is passed that all men should rule over their own households. Act 2, the King's Palace, 4 years later. Scene 1. The Greek campaign has been a disaster and an humiliation. The king is furious, and he wishes that he had a wife to comfort him. So his advisors set out to find the most suitable woman from throughout the empire to replace Queen Vashti. Just imagine the competition from ambitious women and their ambitious mothers. And in chapter 2, verse 8, we read that Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. It seems that Esther didn't push herself forward. Scene 2, in the harem. Esther's natural character charmed Hegai, who favoured her. She underwent a year of beauty treatments, as did the other women, before it was her to follow his instructions. Scene 3. Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate when he hears of a plot to assassinate the king. He tells Esther, who passes on the information to the king, and the king executes the plotters. This incident is recorded in the King's Book of Annals. Act 3. The King's Palace 5 years later. Scene 1. The king appoints Haman the Agagite to be his prime minister. And here we have a historical note. See Samuel 1, chapter 15. Saul had defeated the Amalekites, but he disobeyed God by not killing all of them. Samuel hacks Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to pieces, and the descendants of Agag, the Agagites, bear a grudge against the Jews for some 600 years. So back to our story. The king commands that everybody should kneel and honour Haman. Mordecai refuses, because if he did, he would be breaking the commandment by putting a man in place of God. Haman is enraged, and when he discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, decides to try and kill all the Jews in the empire. He casts lots, known as the pur, to determine the time for his plan to be actioned, which turns out to be 11 months later. He persuades the king to agree that a decree should be issued that the Jews should be destroyed, and the king lets Haman get on with it. Haman wastes no time in sending the decree throughout the empire. Scene 2, the king's gate. When Mordecai hears what Haman has done, he is distraught. He sends a copy of the decree to Esther and instructs her to go to the king to beg for mercy for his people. Esther sends a message back explaining that if anybody goes into the king's presence without being summoned, they will be put to death unless the king extends his golden scepter to them. Then Mordecai explains why it is so important that Esther should go to see the king. And her reply is to ask that all the Jews fast, which included prayer, for 3 days, and then she will go into the king's presence. While she is fasting, she is arranging a banquet for the king. Scene 3, which is 3 days later. In her royal robes, Esther goes to the king. He is pleased to see her and extends the gold scepter to her. He wants to know what it is she wants. Well, she invites the king and Haman to a banquet that she has prepared. The king immediately summons Haman, and they go to the banquet. And after they've eaten and are drinking wine together, the king again asks Esther what she wants. Her reply is that she wants the king and Haman to come to another banquet the next day, when she will answer his question. Scene 4, Haman's home. Although Haman is very happy when he leaves the palace, he's enraged when Mordecai doesn't honour him. He goes home and orders that a giant gallows be built so that he can have Mordecai executed. Act 4. Scene 1, the king's bedroom the next day. The king can't sleep, and he orders that the record of his reign in the Book of Annals is read to him, perhaps so he would be bored to sleep. He hears how Mordecai had reported the plot to assassinate him, and asks how Mordecai has been honoured. When he is told that he hadn't honoured Mordecai, the king sends for an advisor. Now, coincidentally, Haman has just entered the court, and so the king asks him what should be done. Haman thinks that he will be getting the honour, and so he suggests great honours and that they should be shown publicly. Then the king tells him to give the honours to Mordecai, and you can imagine how Haman felt. Scene 2, the Queen's second banquet. After the banquet over the wine, the king asks Esther again what she wants. Now is her moment, and she asks for her life and that of her people, and she names Haman as the man behind the edict that the Jews be destroyed. The king is in a rage, and Haman is executed on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Scene 3, the next day. The king gives Haman's estate to Esther, promotes Mordecai to be prime minister, agrees that the edict against the Jews should be revoked, and that the Jews should be able to take revenge on their enemies. The Feast of Purim is inaugurated by the Jews to celebrate their deliverance. So what can we learn from this amazing story? Well, the key to understanding this book is actually found in chapter 4, verses 13 to 14. When Esther is worried about going into the king's presence without having been summoned, Mordecai sends her a message, and he says, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Mordecai makes two important points. One about how God works in time and eternity, and the other about Esther's involvement in his plans. Well, how does God work? God will rescue his people. Mordecai's speech is based on God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 when he said, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." The importance of God's people, the Jews, being delivered from genocide cannot be underestimated. If the Jews had not survived, then the Lord Jesus, he wouldn't have fulfilled the many Old Testament prophecies about his ancestry, and God's plan of salvation would not have happened. If Esther doesn't go to see the king, God will work in a different way, but she and her family will perish. And Esther's involvement, the reason Esther became queen was to be used of God in saving his people. The king may have thought that he chose Esther to be queen, but she was appointed by God. So how can we apply the lessons of this story to our situation? First of all, God's plan of salvation will not be thwarted. At times it may seem that God is not at work, but he is. His timing is perfect. Sometimes we have to wait for years to see how God was using us. In the story, Mordecai had to wait for 5 years after he warned the king of the assassination plot before he was honoured, following the king's dream, which happened at just the right time. Esther was queen long enough to build a relationship with the king and to know how to approach him. The date that Haman chose by lot for the destruction of the Jews allows enough time for the revoking edict to be communicated throughout the empire. And God can change the mind of kings. We read in Proverbs 21 verse 1, "In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him." And God was able to change the irreversible Persian edict. And God can take those he chooses to do his appointed task. He took a young orphan girl, a fourth-generation immigrant of ethnic minority, to achieve his purposes. God's plans are like the picture on a computer or TV screen. which is made up of millions of individual pixels or dots. However small, each one is important to the picture. Further, God's plans are three-dimensional as he weaves together our existence and actions in time to his existence, knowledge, and plans in eternity. Each of us is like a pixel, a small dot in God's three-dimensional picture, and each dot is important. God is not dependent on us, however. Service is an opportunity for us. If we don't obey him, he'll use somebody else, but we will lose out. We don't necessarily know God's plans. Esther didn't know why she had become queen, and Mordecai didn't know what the result would be when he revealed the plot to assassinate the king. The important thing is not our knowledge, but our relationship with God. Before she went to see the king, Esther spent 3 days in fasting, prayer, and preparation. I'm sure when she went in to see the king, she was sending up arrow prayers. But we need to remember that arrow prayers are based on our hearts and our relationship with God. When Nehemiah sent his famous arrow prayer, as the king asked him what he wanted, it was after he had spent some days in mourning, fasting, and praying about the situation. And so that brings us home to the area in which we live. What is God doing in our villages? You may have served him faithfully for years, and it seems that the work is dying out, just as a new housing estate is being built. We don't know what God is planning, how he is at work, or what his timing is. The plan may be wider than our village, so what happens in our chapel may be part of his larger plan geographically and a larger plan in time and eternity. We may be a small dot, but we are an essential part of the bigger picture. Our responsibility is to be faithful and patient servants like Esther. We are called to obey, to do the job we've been asked to do, to live our lives in accordance with the scriptures and leave the rest to God, just as Esther did. And in conclusion, let me just read a few verses from Romans 11. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out! Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God, that God should repay them? For from him, and through him, and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen.